absolutely everything you believe about yourself and the universe around you could be an illusion. As far as you know, you're a real person, living in a universe that came into existence roughly 14 billion years ago, and that eventually gave rise to galaxies, stars, planets, and eventually you. Except maybe not. It's possible you don't actually exist in any conventional sense at all, and are instead something closer to the dream of a dead universe, along with literally everything else you think exists around you. That sounds completely unhinged, but it may actually be an unavoidable consequence of taking our best current physics seriously. Let's build up to it properly, because it genuinely does make a strange kind of sense by the end. Understanding this idea requires three separate concepts, starting with something deceptively simple: the arrow of time. What actually distinguishes the past from the future? Drop a bit of red ink into a glass of water, and you'll watch it spread out until it evenly colors the whole glass, and it will never spontaneously unspread itself back into a single concentrated drop. Time always seems to run in whichever direction the ink is dispersing. But zoom in with a microscope, and all you'd actually see is an enormous swarm of individual molecules colliding completely at random, with no built-in forward or backward direction at all. Every single one of those tiny collisions is, on its own, perfectly reversible. So where does our stubborn sense of one-directional time actually come from? It turns out the arrow of time isn't a fundamental law of physics at all. It's simply a matter of overwhelming probability. Once the ink molecules have spread throughout the glass, there are an enormous number of different ways to arrange them that all look basically the same, spread out. There's only one arrangement that looks like a single concentrated drop. Exactly the same logic as buying more lottery tickets, improving your odds of winning. Since there are vastly more spread out arrangements than concentrated drop arrangements, the ink overwhelmingly tends to end up spread out. Not because concentrating back into a drop is against the laws of physics, but because it's staggeringly, astronomically unlikely. To actually watch the reverse happen, the ink spontaneously reassembling itself into a single red drop, you'd need to wait somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to the power of 10 to the 106th years, a 1, followed by more zeros than there are atoms in the observable universe. But given that much time, sheer random chance means you actually would eventually see it happen. And with enough time on top of that, random molecular motion could, in principle, assemble into literally any shape at all, including, purely as a strange example, a small, soggy red brain. Now, the second idea, the far future of the universe itself. Our universe began roughly 14 billion years ago, in the Big Bang, then expanded and evolved into the vast collection of galaxies, stars, and everything else we see today. In a sense, the whole universe is a lot like that glass of water, with ink actively spreading through it. It has its own arrow of time. But unlike a static glass, the universe keeps expanding, and thanks to dark energy, that expansion is actually accelerating. Everything inside it is steadily getting more diluted as space itself stretches. In roughly 100 trillion years, the very last star anywhere will finally burn out. After that, essentially nothing interesting happens for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. Durations so large that the usual units, like decillions or googles of years, barely capture it. Eventually, the universe becomes a dark, rapidly expanding volume of nearly empty space, completely dominated by dark energy. You might reasonably assume that's the final, permanent death of everything. But dark energy actually has one more surprise in store. In a universe this dominated by dark energy, space expands so aggressively that it creates a cosmic horizon around every point, a boundary beyond which nothing, not even light, could ever reach you again. For all practical purposes, the universe effectively becomes a sealed container of finite size, something like 36 billion light-years across, closed off by that impassable cosmic horizon. And a sealed region like that behaves, in a very real physical sense, like a giant black hole turned inside out. We already know, thanks to quantum effects, that every black hole slowly leaks a tiny trickle of particles over time, a phenomenon called Hawking radiation. And our inside-out cosmic black hole does exactly the same thing. Over an inconceivably long stretch of time, that trickle of radiation gradually refills the sealed universe with particles once again. At that point, so far in the future that assigning it an actual number stops meaning anything useful, the universe finally settles into its true final state, a closed box filled with particles sitting at an extremely low, but still technically non-zero, temperature. And because that temperature isn't quite absolute zero, those particles keep undergoing constant, tiny random motions forever. In other words, a sealed glass filled with water and ink, with a literally infinite amount of time still stretching out ahead of it. Which means things are about to get interesting again. That brings us to the third idea: typing monkeys and universes that pop into existence out of nowhere. Eternity turns out to be an extraordinarily long stretch of time, long enough that even the most staggeringly unlikely events eventually become essentially guaranteed to happen, probably more than once. All those fluctuating particles keep colliding with each other over and over, endlessly generating every conceivable combination that's physically possible, sooner or later. It's the same underlying logic as a monkey typing completely at random on a typewriter forever. Almost all of the output is meaningless gibberish, but given enough time, purely by chance, it will eventually type out entire coherent passages, and eventually, entire coherent, structured worlds. If the particles in our sealed, dead universe can spontaneously arrange themselves into literally any possible configuration, what might that actually include? A random fluctuation could, in principle, assemble into a planet, or a galaxy, or a great many galaxies at once, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe our own universe has technically already ended, and everything currently around us is really a spontaneously fluctuated pop-up universe. Not one that gradually evolved out of an actual Big Bang, but one that fluctuated into brief existence purely by random chance. And that will, exactly like that original drop of ink, only persist for a while before dissolving right back into randomness. Because it would be the product of pure randomness. A pop-up universe like that could closely resemble our own, but riddled with small, arbitrary glitches nobody inside it would ever be able to explain. Maybe in one such universe, some small anatomical detail about a familiar animal is subtly, inexplicably wrong. Maybe the exact numeric value of some fundamental physical constant is oddly, inexplicably different from what the surrounding physics would otherwise predict. Scientists living inside a universe like that would have absolutely no way to notice or account for those glitches from the inside, which raises an uncomfortable possibility of its own. Maybe some of the genuinely deepest unsolved mysteries in physics today are really just meaningless quirks baked into our own particular pop-up universe. Artifacts of how it happened to randomly fluctuate into existence, rather than anything with a deeper explanation at all. Not every possible fluctuation is equally likely, though. Smaller, simpler fluctuations are dramatically more probable than larger, more complex ones. A single planet is far more likely to spontaneously fluctuate into existence than an entire galaxy. But there's something that turns out to be even more probable, by an enormous margin, than either one. A single, isolated human brain fluctuating into existence entirely on its own, with absolutely nothing else around it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Could you, right now, actually just be a disembodied brain like that? You think, and therefore, in some basic sense, you exist, but what else can you actually be certain of beyond that single fact? Ultimately, your brain does its work by interpreting a continuous stream of incoming sensory signals and constructing the entire experienced world you perceive directly out of that interpretation. Which means, at least in principle, you could just be a brain that happens to be interpreting a rich, convincing sense that a physical world and body exist around it, without either one actually being there. And if you follow the exact same probability logic used for the ink in that sealed universe glass, you could specifically be a disembodied brain that fluctuated into brief existence purely by chance inside an otherwise dead, empty universe, already fully equipped with an entire lifetime's worth of memories and knowledge that never actually happened. It's a genuinely bizarre claim on its face, but running the actual numbers makes it surprisingly difficult to dismiss. Compare the total number of real, embodied brains that will ever exist inside a normally living, evolving universe against the number of disembodied, naked brains that would eventually fluctuate into existence inside a dead one. Being extremely generous, imagine roughly 100 quadrillion humans eventually live on Earth, and that a comparable number of beings eventually live around every other star throughout the universe. Add all of that together, and you land on something like 10 to the power of 41 total embodied brains that will ever exist across all of cosmic history. But in a dead universe that has enough time to eventually explore every single possible fluctuation, and that then keeps existing forever afterward, The number of disembodied brains that eventually fluctuate into existence isn't just large, it's genuinely infinite. Which means the probability that you specifically are one of those randomly fluctuated brains isn't just larger than the probability that you're a real, ordinary embodied human. It's so overwhelmingly, incomparably larger that the two numbers can't meaningfully be compared at all. How exactly do you compare any finite number, however large, to actual infinity? So, are you actually a disembodied, floating brain existing for one single, fleeting moment, followed by an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of nothing before another brief, disconnected moment eventually fluctuates into existence somewhere else? Maybe not even necessarily in that order. Maybe your subjective experience of your own life is, in some sense, actually unfolding backwards, and you'd have absolutely no way to notice from the inside. Maybe some version of you, or something functionally identical to you, has already fluctuated into brief existence and back out again countless trillions of times before this exact moment. Are you, right now, quite literally the dream of a dead universe? Really? Genuinely? Actually? Well, probably not, and it's worth being honest about exactly why. First, there are some real loopholes in the argument worth taking seriously. Dark energy might behave in ways fundamentally different from our current best models once we understand it better, steering the universe toward a completely different ultimate fate entirely. Or a truly dead, maximally diluted universe might simply be too inert, too motionless, to ever actually generate a functioning brain through fluctuation, even given a genuinely infinite amount of time to work with. Or the universe might end up dying in some entirely different way we haven't even properly considered yet. Our current understanding of cosmology, honestly, still isn't solid enough for anyone to seriously start worrying about whether there's secretly a fluctuated brain or not. But set those specific loopholes aside for a moment, because there's a deeper, more elegant problem baked directly into the argument itself. If you genuinely were a randomly fluctuated brain, then every physical law and scientific fact currently stored inside that brain would itself have arisen purely at random, purely by chance, meaning it wouldn't actually have any real, reliable connection to how an actual external universe genuinely works. But those exact same physical laws are precisely what we used just now to construct the entire argument that convinced you that you're probably a fluctuated brain in the first place. Which means that even if you did, for some reason, end up believing you're a floating brain, you'd simultaneously have to admit you have absolutely no good reason to actually trust that specific belief, since a genuinely randomly fluctuated brain would have no reliable reason to trust any of its own beliefs about physics at all, including that one. So, this whole strange hypothetical detour might genuinely teach us something real and useful about the limits and internal consistency of our current physical theories. But in the end, it's best understood as a deliberately weird stress test of what's technically possible to construct using the tools of modern physics, and a genuine exercise in exactly what kinds of thoughts a brain and a body are even capable of entertaining in the first place. So, in all likelihood, you can relax. You are probably not the dream of a dead universe. Probably